Well, hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fourth webinar in our National Farm Health and Safety Week series. Today, we are going to be talking about emergency action plans and what they are and why you need one. First, I want to thank the wonderful company for their support and sponsorship of this week. They've made it possible to make all these things free and available to you, so we want to appreciate their support. My name is Natalie Gupton, and I am the Director of Business Services and Industry Relations for AgSafe. So AgSafe is headquartered in Modesto, California, and I am all the way on the other side of the country in Louisville, Kentucky. So we work nationally. We try to stay on top of everything, focusing on safety and compliance and human resources. So follow us on social media. Will also be posting the recording of today's webinar there. So you can find us at AgSafe online. And also encourage you to check out our website. If you like what you're seeing and hearing today, hopefully we have some more resources and information for you available on our website. Before we jump in, just a quick disclaimer, and I'll give you just a moment to review that on your own. All right, thank you for reviewing that. So we're going to dive into today's content. We are together for just a short time, so we're just going to do a general overview of everything. But first of all, we're going to talk about federal OSHA and requirements that are related to the Emergency Action Plan, review of pre-emergency planning, but also talk about some steps to take during some specific emergencies. So talk about earthquake and fire, wildfires, and medical emergencies. So first of all, emergency action plan. It's the policies, the procedures, the steps that you take that you have available for your farm, for your company, that you provide to protect all individuals involved. And so the statement of why do you need one? Well, federal OSHA says you have to have one, but also it's a good best practice. You know, whether you or not you fall under OSHA regulations, it's important that you have an emergency action plan, whether it is extremely formal or that you just have a system in place that you are going to use to assist you and your family and your farm if an emergency were to happen. So on the screen, you'll see all the pieces that OSHA would like to have in your emergency action plan. And again, if you're not required by OSHA to have them, this is a great checklist or guidance to look at to incorporate into your plan for your farm. Specifically, the OSHA regulation or the OSHA standard that speaks to emergency action plans is 1910-38. And within that, it says an emergency action plan must be in writing, kept in the workplace, and available to employees for review. However, an employer with 10 or fewer employees may communicate the plan orally to employees. And then you can cross out employees and say family, because you've just got to have some type of plan. So first of all, if you are required to do this, you need to have it in writing. And minimally, you need to have these things that are stated on the screen. So first of all, you need to have emergency escape routes and procedures for evacuation. And now we're going to go through different types of emergencies. So you're going to have to think through your plan and relate those procedures and evacuations related to that specific type of emergency. You know, your plan on paper may be general, but thinking and speaking to those specifics will be important and very much a part of that preparation to take the right actions during a real emergency. You need to have an alarm system. If you dive into the standard a little bit more, it speaks to having different types of alarms for different types of emergencies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. A means to account for all employees after evacuation. So you need to have a system. You need to know who's in charge of taking roll, knowing who showed up for work today, who stayed home, who called in sick, potentially knowing the whereabouts of employees at the time of the emergency, so you can gather that roll and account for people and know if anyone is missing. You need to have procedures for employees who remain to operate equipment shutdown prior to evacuation. So again, this kind of depends on the type of emergency, but you've got to know who those people are if those actions need to happen. Because when emergencies ensue, chaos sometimes tends to overtake reasonable thinking. And so establishing these people up front will help prevent some of that chaos. Having rescue and medical duties and training for those employees who are to perform them. So having people assigned or having people trained and certified in first aid and CPR is a requirement for some states for a certain amount of people, but also a good practice. You've got to have somebody around, even if it's just the family farm, that would help assist with those medical emergencies with first aid and CPR. Preferred means of reporting fires and other emergencies. Names or job titles of persons or departments who can be contacted for information or explanation of the plan. Sometimes an emergency is not as dire as some, and so having a little bit more time to have the opportunity to call for assistance could be a possibility depending on the situation. And so having that information available is important. And training when the plan is developed on initial assignment and when the plan changes. So I'll talk about that just a little bit more too. But as with anything, and what AgSafe preaches is that training is the first line of defense for accidents, for incidents, for chaos during emergencies. You've got to train. Again, I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that in just a moment. But look at the bottom of this slide, I will be sending these out in an email as well. But on the bottom of this slide is that link directly to those OSHA standards if you're concerned, and you can dig into that standard just a little bit more. Next, on this slide, you see an example of a farm emergency plan. Work smarter, not harder. There's several templates out there. Take advantage of those. Use them and then make them your own. Don't take them as is. You want to make it very relevant for your farm and for your operation. And this one from Michigan State University is comprehensive. I believe it's about 14 pages long. but check it out. It's a great place to start, whether you actually use that fillable PDF or you use a pen and paper. But it's a great place to start, and wanted to give that resource to you. Next, North Carolina Department of Agriculture also has one available, a little bit more simplistic, but also it still gets the job done and gets you the information on paper that you need. And again, take advantage of those resources and not have to work harder than you need to. As a part of your emergency action plan, it's important to have maps available. One, so people know when on site where to go, but also sharing those with your first responders and having them available throughout your facilities, whether it's your company and your place of business or your farm, and having it in the shop, your house, in the barn, in a couple places, having it available so people know where to go and report to when emergencies occur. A great place to access Google Maps could be as simple as taking a screenshot of the Google map of your farm off the computer. But you also can access a little bit more formal map from the Farm Service Agency, and taking advantage of those resources that are out there for you through the USDA Farm Service Agency. And having a map will enable responders to see where the fields are located. And then, if you happen to have any visitors or, relatives of your workers on site, that they can actually refer to that if the need arises. And thinking about the types of emergencies that you may encounter on your operation. So on the screen, you'll see natural and man-made. Depending on where you are in the country, some are a little bit more prominent than others. Our friends in California, you guys are very much dealing with wildfire situation, while our friends down on the coast in Florida right now are dealing with hurricanes. And then, here in the Midwest, I'm in Kentucky. Who knows? It could be a tornado, it could be lightning, it could be flooding at this time of year. So knowing what you encounter the most, clearly you want to prepare for, but also don't take for granted that one of these natural disasters could just be right around the corner. Recently, last year, a year or two ago, in Tennessee, we had an unprecedented wildfire. We don't have them very often, but it did happen. And so taking those things into consideration as you prepare your emergency action plan is important. And a lot of times, but not always, you do have a little bit of warning when it comes to those natural disasters and those natural emergencies. On your right side of the screen for man-made, most of the time you don't have any warning when these occur. An explosion, animal handling, grain entrapment, amputations, any type of physical accident that an employee may encounter, or a worker of any sort. And so training one to prevent those is clearly important, but you'll also need to make sure that you train on what to do when they occur. Okay, so planning and preparation. Clearly, emergency action plan is very much a part of the planning and preparation, but things to consider is to pre-plan with first responders. Depending on the communities that you're in, more often than not, they are more than happy to come to your facility, do a walkthrough, and become familiar with your property and the areas that potential hazards could be available. And some things to consider and walk through with your first responders are just first of all, going through your farm's physical layout and including your buildings as well as your structures. And importantly, you know, for our folks in the Midwest, grain bins. And, you know, those unfortunately are those incidences that happen so quickly, and knowing exactly where they are for a first responder is essential. Point out hazardous chemicals if you have a pesticide storage area. You know, pointing out the types of equipment, where they're stored, where they're worked on, to those first responders. Letting them know about your utilities, where that main control point is, the cutoff, and share some of the evacuation plans and the procedures that you have, and so that that first responder will know a little bit more about your operation. Training. It's not enough to just have the plan. You've got to let everyone know about it and walk them through on the key points of that plan with them, and continuously train. And train and practice to a degree go hand in hand, especially with emergency preparation. When emergencies happen, you almost have to act on instinct and routine versus clear thought. So the more you practice and do walkthroughs and drills, the more that it becomes internalized, and those employees, those family members are able to go into an autopilot to deal with the situation at hand, because time is of the essence, and not knowing what to do delays important action that could potentially save a life. You know, you need to train everyone on evacuation plans, your alarm systems, what they mean, when to use them, when you need to activate them, reporting procedures for personnel, shutdown procedures, and types of potential emergencies. And, you know, regardless of your training approach, you know, whether it's a formal classroom setting with PowerPoints and handouts and handbooks, or it's verbal and talking it through and walking through with your people, the training is as important part of a good emergency plan as having the plan itself. And then with the practice and the drills, you need to go back and review. You know, after each drill, have a meeting, review what happened, why it happened, and what could have been done better. You know, through the practice process, but also if you have a real emergency, having that debrief after the dust settles to make sure that your plan actually worked, because we can only assume, we can only speculate, but until an actual emergency happens, we really don't know if that actual plan is the best plan for you. So if one does occur, take that time, sit back, review, talk through with your people to see what worked, what didn't work, and what needs to be changed. Okay, alarms. So your general emergency procedures. People don't know what to do if they don't know an emergency is happening. So you can have different situations where it could be a verbal notification, radio, cell phone, an air horn, different types of notifications for different situations. But also think about your location, your span of space and area, and the number of people that you need to notify. Is cell phone calls or notifications enough Will there always be cell phone service? Are you located in an area where there's spotty service? So knowing that and accounting for that, you need to take in consideration when alerting your folks about an emergency. Emergency gathering locations. Do you know where it is right now? Do you actually have one? So you need to identify areas where your people need to go in case of an emergency. It could be a couple different spots, depending how large you are. If you have multiple locations, consider that as well. And then with those emergency gathering locations, again, going back to the beginning and having procedures for accounting for everyone, you know, taking into account all of your gathering locations and those people that are responsible for accounting for those people. And your evacuation procedures, you know, take into account all the various locations and facilities that you have available on your operation. You know, your offices, farms, shops, do you have labor housing, all your different fields, your different structures. Think of those evacuation procedures. You know, if you have that formalized plan, you know, having those maps and those exit routes labeled on those maps, as well as your lighting and your signage for those routes as well. You know, if you're a large organization, a formal business, have several employees, you've got to have your lighted exit signs, labeling things that could be mistaked as an exit. There's lots of things to consider there, and make sure that you have your ducks in a row as far as evacuation as well as exiting buildings. Okay, just to touch on and highlight a few things, you know, fire procedures, and this could vary depending on if it's a fire inside, it's a fire outside, but clearly you want to stay calm. Notify everyone in the area to evacuate and meet in a designated area. Call 911 or activate a fire alarm before attempting to put out the fire with an extinguisher. You know, having folks trained on the proper use of a fire extinguisher, having the right fire extinguishers available for the types of fires that could happen in your facilities. Never let the fire get between you and the way out. Watch to make sure it doesn't reignite, and supervisors, farmers, you, mom, dad, perform that head count and make sure everyone is accounted for. Okay, there was a great question. It says, what would be an example of a procedure to alert employees of an emergency when out in the field? Depending on your location, it's going to be what's going to work best for you. So it could be you have a phone tree. You call your supervisor or your crew leader, who will then be alerted of what's going on. You could be as sophisticated as having a speaker hookup that you can send a signal to with a very loud, piercing alarm. So there could be a variety of things. You could equip your main employees with a walkie-talkie, which often would have a alert or a buzzer with that could produce a sound that could alert that employee. So it really depends on the space and the distance between the person making the alert and the people in the field. You know, you could even think of having an air horn in your foreman's truck, and they can grab it, and if they're covering a field, multiple acres, then that should be sufficient to let people know that are physically working in the field at that moment. So you got to be specific and strategic in deciding what's going to work best, and also the type of emergencies that may occur that would affect the people working in the field. Earthquake procedures, taking in account, your different structures and buildings that you have on site, what to do when in the field, in a vehicle, and what to do after an earthquake. And, with all these instances, there's lots of information out there. There's a great website. It's simple. It's called ready.gov, READY.gov. And it talks through different types of preparation that you can make for different types of emergencies, whether it's a tornado, an earthquake, or even an explosion. Flooding and severe weather, most of the time you do have a little bit of warning to know what to do, or a little bit of warning to make preliminary preparation, to make the call when you need to initiate your action plan for some of these emergencies. Your medical emergency procedures, again, these are the ones that you often have zero warning for, and you have to be ready at a second's notice. And carefully training folks on what to do when there is a medical emergency. Evaluate the situation and condition of the employee, what to do if it's serious or life-threatening versus non-life-threatening, and touching on those as well is important within your training. It's a great best practice, to have an emergency contact information. As much as we think that we know our people, we know our employees, it's important to have this in a safe place that you can refer to and quickly access if you need to. If you've known your employee Joe for years and years, and you know where he goes to church, and you know where his kids go to school, but do you actually know this important information if an emergency was to happen and you need to notify next of kin? Next, wildfires. This is something, unfortunately, that some of you may be experiencing right now, and knowing immediately what to do and to take action during a wildfire, and being aware of those potential hazards that occur with wildfires, and that exposure that your employees are presented. Wildfires present hazards that employees in affected areas must understand, and hazardous conditions are not always visible. So smoke from wildfires can contain chemicals, gas, and different fine particles that can harm a person's health. They can hurt your eyes, irritate your respiratory system, or even worsen a chronic heart or a lung disease that that individual is already experiencing. They may continue even after fires have been extinguished and cleanups have begun, and the aftermath of a wildfire can cause injury, illness, and even death due to the effects that it's had on the environment and the soils and the structures around it. And so taking this into account and being aware of that is vital. You always want to assess an affected wildfire area and take the right actions that are necessary to protect everyone during and after a fire emergency. Having personal protective equipment available, proper PPE and training is required for worker safety in wildfire regions. wear protective gear when entering contaminated areas, including appropriate respirators, safety glasses, boots, hard hats, so on and so forth. And having that available, again, is vital to have appropriate action during and after wildfires. So some resources available to you. Again, work smarter, not harder. This is, this is your first encounter with developing emergency action plan. OSHA has this great fact sheet. It's about 4 pages. It's a great high-level overview and gives you things to consider as you start to work out your plan. And finally, our reminders, review your farm's emergency plan at least once a year, including your evacuation procedures and your meeting locations. Always know the address and location of where you're working, but also have folks know how to explain where they are, because sometimes an address is pointless depending on where you are and your location. My farm, at my family's farm, we have our home address, but the fields and everywhere in the working parts that emergencies could occur, we can get a first responder to our house, but knowing how to explain to get to a certain area of the farm will be important. And equipping employees, equipping family members on being able to explain these things and give proper landmarks to people, to your first responders, is vital. And then know how to get help and evacuation routes for the various locations. And that just reiterates the point that you've got to explain where you are. And so with that, I have reached the end of today's webinar. I know I went through a lot very quickly. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions. Thank you, Christina. I hope I answered your question. If not, let me know. I'll help some more. Tomorrow is our last webinar in the series. We are going to talk about sexual harassment prevention. Again, 30 minutes tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific time, noon Eastern Standard Time. I hope you're able to join us. Registration's still available to get that link. And finally, I just want to thank the wonderful company again for their support of this week. And with that, I will stay on a couple more minutes if anybody has any further questions, but I appreciate your time and thank you and hope you have a safe day.